This episode is brought to you by my fertility awareness programs. Master fertility awareness and improve your menstrual cycle health at the same time. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workwithme for more information. That's fertilityfriday.com/workwithme. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 161. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I've had so many requests to talk about IUDs on the show. It's a topic that has come up here and there, but I haven't really focused on it in an entire episode. So I'm really excited to bring today's episode to you. In today's episode, I'm interviewing Dr. Steve Gangemi, and we're talking about IUDs and breaking down the differences between the hormonal IUD and the copper IUD, so that if you've ever thought about getting one, it's the information that you need to know before you go into actually getting one inserted. And if you already have one, and you're thinking whether or not you should get it removed, if you're thinking about using fertility awareness, then some additional information that you will want to know about it. For those of you who are thinking about transitioning to the fertility awareness method as birth control, or trying to conceive and really wanting to understand what's happening in your cycles and even strive for some improvements in your menstrual cycle parameters, I would invite you to head over to my Work With Me page. So you'll find that at fertilityfriday.com/workwithme. I have a number of programs directed specifically at helping you to master fertility awareness, to gain confidence in charting, and also to gain a much deeper understanding of your menstrual cycle and how your cycle is intimately connected to your overall health and fertility. So head over to fertilityfriday.com/workwithme for more information about my fertility awareness programs. And now, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Dr. Stephen Gangemi, to the show. Dr. Gangemi is a chiropractic physician and clinical nutritionist with a passion for natural health care, and specifically in the field of nutrition and manual therapies. He has 20 years of clinical experience as a practitioner of complementary sports medicine and holistic therapies for patients dealing with a variety of ailments such as hormonal imbalances, digestive disturbances, immune dysfunction, and musculoskeletal problems. So I reached out to Dr. Gangemi because of an article that he wrote about IUDs. And I'm really excited today to talk to him about his clinical experience and his expertise in the area of IUD, because as my longtime listeners know, that's a topic that I haven't had an opportunity to go into a whole lot, but I've had tons of emails and tons of questions and tons of requests from listeners to talk about it. So welcome to the show, Dr. Gangemi.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lisa. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we jump into it, I always ask my guests, what was it that actually drew you into the field of chiropractic medicine and now holistic medicine?
Pretty much when I was in high school many decades ago, well, I guess 25 years ago, like most chiropractors, I hurt my back during a wrestling practice in high school. Ended up seeing my mom's friend's friend of a friend chiropractor, and he sort of turned me on to it. And then went to chiropractic school, but while I was in chiropractic school, I became more interested in more of the muscular conditions like fascial connections within the body and how it interacts with our nervous system and our organs and our hormones and our nutrition and everything, our lifestyle. And then I really went more in the nutrition, neurological, biochemistry route, along with more soft tissue manual therapies rather than the adjustment type of therapies. So,
Well, and I suppose the question of the day is, what prompted you to write your article about IUDs and essentially become kind of outspoken about opposed to them, which is not, most people sing their praises. So let's talk about how that started.
Sure. Well, I think, this article on my drgangemi.com site, I think it's about 3, maybe going on 4 years old, actually. And I wrote that back then because I had seen several women and was always, each year seeing a good amount of new patient females come in with an IUD, either the hormonal type, typically the Mirena, or the copper type, the Paragard. And they were just having a variety of symptoms, everything from, depression to maybe hip or back pain to hormonal issues or something like that, a wide variety of things. And for the most part, their problem or their main problem or their host of problems ended up being in part or completely due to the IUD. And I would always see and still do when a woman's taking any type of birth control, typically the pill, which is, more common that I see today, I guess, some sort of oral birth control pill. I typically still see issues with those women, hormonal detoxification issues, liver issues, or some hormonal interference. But with the IUD, you kind of enter a whole new realm because the female has this foreign device basically inserted in her body that, is extremely unnatural. No matter how you look at it. And there's just not, as you know, there's not a lot of information out there. So, and then, my patients would ask me and their friends would ask me, why do we have this problem or what's going on? So I basically compiled my clinical experience within that article, which I termed, the IUD intrauterine damage rather than device, sort of a play on the words there. And I mean, it really took off for an article on my site. I mean, there's something like, I don't even know. I mean, hundreds of comments from women all over the world, actually, who, for the most part, just share their story on how the IUD has affected them. And I would say, I don't think there's any positive comment about the IUD on my comment page on the site. I think they're all either thanking me, for being outspoken about and helping them, or them, talking about their experience with the IUD. And it's been a great response to the article. I mean, some of the stories, you read them and, some of them are actually pretty sad, how women have lived with these issues all their life. And, women are always told they're crazy whenever they have their hormonal issues, typically from their medical doctors anyway. So many of these women are being told, no, it's not, the IUD can't do that. That's all in your head, and, even some of them gone back to their doctors over and over. And, finally, after years of living in whatever type of problem or health concern, health issue they finally have it out. And, of course, it's all, well, I wish I did that when I had this problem many years ago. So it's been great for me. Again, as sad as the stories can be, that I've been able to, help many women who I've, of course, never even met. And, it's been a great response to see that, that so many people have had, literally like life-changing responses from having the IUD removed.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for the listeners who may not be, who may not have used the IUD personally, or who may not know a whole lot about it, I mean, there's a ton of Facebook groups with thousands of women in them who've had negative effects from IUDs. So it's a real thing. And so going back to basics for the listeners who may not be familiar, could you just kind of walk us through, so, what's an IUD, and then what are the two main types? I suppose we could start there.
Sure. Well, basically, I mean, you have this IUD, this sort of intrauterine device, it's sort of like a T-shaped device that's inserted into the uterus. And for the most part, they should be, let's not say 100%, because nothing's 100% effective in birth control methods, except for, of course, abstinence. But, they're highly effective. I forget the actual number, but well into the 90s, of a long-acting form of contraceptive. So typically 5 to 10 years. And you've got your two main types. Now, I will admit that there might be another. I'm not sure if there's another hormonal type out. I know I'm familiar with Mirena and the lesser used device called Skyla. Those are your hormonal types that are the most common. And that those basically give off a low, continuous dose of synthetic progesterone. Basically, as you know, that acts to like thicken the cervical mucus to, keep a, sperm from penetrating the egg and, keeping a woman from getting pregnant. So a lot of women, use these strictly to help with PMS and heavy bleeding and that sort of thing. And, they say Mirena is good for a good 5 years. And then you have the copper types. Now, this one has no hormonal effect, at least directly. There's no hormone being released. And that's the Paragard. That's a copper wire, again, a T-shaped IUD, pretty much acts to kill sperm. So it's basically a spermicide. And then it also increases the copper ions in the cervical mucus. There have been evidences of that, or instances where women have become toxic in copper because, there's obviously a direct connection or a direct interaction with the cervical mucus there. So some companies are starting to use gold and silver wrapped around the copper. I'm not sure how prevalent that still is today. Anyhow, but that's the Paragard. I believe that the Paragard, it's a little bit less effective than the Mirena, but they say you can keep that one in for 10 years. So some women tend to opt for the Paragard because they don't want the hormonal effects, but they can keep it in as twice as long. They sort of weigh the risk-benefit ratios between the two of them. But those are your two main ones, the hormonal Mirena and the copper Paragard.
I find it very interesting, the marketing techniques, as you can imagine, of hormonal birth control. And so calling something low dose gives the impression that you're just, you're barely getting any hormones, and it's not really going to do anything. And it's totally different from hormonal birth control. So what are your thoughts on that?
It drives me crazy, honestly. I mean, I had a college girl who I've seen since she was 12 years old. She's now 18, almost 19, and told me the same thing, just a few hours ago as my last patient this Thursday evening in my office. And she's having hormonal, general hormonal issues, and she's been on the birth control pill for a year. And of course, when I ask her about it in the type, and, it's the lowest dose available. And, is a low dose better than a high dose? Well, I think for the most part, yeah, but that doesn't mean you're not going to have an issue with it. I mean, you're talking about a synthetic dose of hormones. You're talking about suppressing natural hormonal levels. You're altering biochemistry within your body. So, personally, I don't think any synthetic, foreign, whatever word, whatever word you want to use, form of birth control is healthy for a female. I get it that, for some women, of course, especially single younger women, getting pregnant would be the worst thing in their lives. So you have to weigh the risk benefit ratio of all these things. Unfortunately, many women are on, especially this girl particularly, she's not on the pill for contraceptive reasons, but as many younger and younger women are today. I mean, I see girls 14, 15 years old. I can actually say 13, 14 on birth control pills for, PMS and other hormonal imbalances / disorders. And it's pretty sad that we're starting to alter girls' hormonal cycles, which is, a wonderful way on how they can really be in tune with their body. And we're completely altering that system at such a young age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something I've talked about on the show quite extensively. And it's just, I could go down that rabbit hole for days. But there's just it's so problematic at such a young age to start, putting women on hormones, because what it does is it shuts down your body's ability to create the natural hormones, because that's what you have to do in order to create a birth control method that is effective. So let's talk a little bit about some of the side effects. So when you're working with your female patients, it's interesting in the article because basically what the message that I got from reading it was that, in your practice, you have women coming in and they're having all of these symptoms. So they're talking to you about these different symptoms, but in their minds, they've never even thought that it could be related to their IUDs. So maybe you could share a little bit about the experiences you've had with that.
Sure. And, it's kind of funny that, what you just said a minute ago. As you can talk for, hours or days about hormones, as I can too, I can tell you, I don't want to say hundreds of stories, but, dozens of stories of in-person, office visits with these type of women, as well as, easily a couple dozen online phone consults that I've done over the years with women. It's interesting because what you see is very, very rarely, I would say, that a woman has an IUD inserted and she feels a problem immediately. I would say that that's more rare. Okay, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but typically it's one of these things that becomes a problem over time, almost like the body is saying, I kind of use the example in the article, like if you always had a pebble in your shoe, you might not notice it right away, Or maybe you do, but then you get used to it. You alter your gait a little bit. Your foot kind of changes how your gait pattern is, how your foot lands. And then you sort of get used to that. But now you develop like a hip problem or a back problem from how you're walking differently from this stone in your shoe. And I kind of look at the IUD to some degree. So let's just talk about how any foreign device would cause this, in this case, in a very sensitive, organ, the uterus, right? We're not talking about, a finger, something, tying around your ankle or your finger or something like that, and even just cutting off a little circulation. We're talking about a very delicate organ. So in a way, there's not you'll get different effects with the Paragard versus the Mirena, so the copper versus the hormonal, different symptoms. But for the most part, just having this foreign T device, this piece of wire inserted, can create a whole host of hormonal issues as well as structural issues in the woman. I think what happens is they don't notice it right away, or they feel maybe some discomfort. I'm not a woman. I can't tell you from experience. I'm kind of just relaying what I hear. And then they sort of get used to it, and then they end up with a different problem later on, maybe a month later, or maybe several months later, or even several years later. And of course, they're not going to, equate that to when they had the IUD put in. And I think what I hear from a lot of women, it's like their intuition tells them that something's not right. I remember one woman specifically, and I think it's one of the comments on the article, or maybe it was a personal email, I can't remember. But this woman, she just knew something was wrong with her. And she's Googling, I think it was like at 2 a.m. one night, finds my article by searching something like IUD problems or IUD damage or whatever. And, finds it at 2, 3 a.m, has the IUD removed it, calls her doctor first thing, 8 a.m. the next morning, has it removed, and she's 90% better by the end of that day. And just has that inkling, that intuition, and this woman had the IUD for, a long time. And I don't think I'm exaggerating, but my memory tells me it was like years on this woman, but she was just told that it's not the IUD. Sometimes the doctors check them and they say, well, it's in the right place, so it can't be causing that. Likewise, I've seen women, where it's not in the right place. I can tell you a pretty wild story. And this is I did a phone consult 2-3 years ago with a very well-known actual neonatal surgeon. This woman was still is hopefully a cardiac surgeon at a very well-known hospital. And she was the one who could do this special technique for the young babies for whatever the heart issue was. And she had to wear one of these, since it was all done, very, very intricately under high magnification. She had to wear this really heavy, I think it was like a 40-pound leaded vest. And she couldn't do her job because she was having this terrible pelvic pain, this terrible back pain, all these problems. Now, all I could do was talk to her, and see her face and, ask her about her history and all these things. Again, a doctor, a very smart woman. And she's, telling about her history. And I'm like, well, did you ever do this? And ask her all these questions. And she didn't really write much on the history page that she sent me. And then it comes out that, she has an IUD in. And I was like, well, when did you have the IUD in? And she's like, well, a couple years ago. When did your problem start? She goes, probably about a year and a half ago. And it was just all too, I guess you could say coincidental, that happened after. Mm-hmm. But of course, you can get a whole host of other things. Anyway, she basically, I in a way convinced her to have the IUD removed, because what did she have to lose, and, of course I make sure, don't, make sure, you can get pregnant. So let's not have a new issue here if you don't want to get pregnant. But she went to her colleague to have it removed the next day. And the guy told her that it had actually fallen out of place and was like sitting like on the back of her uterus cervix area. I forget the exact location, but basically it wasn't even in place. And she had that removed, and within a couple of weeks, I remember her saying something like she was 70 or 80% improved already just in those couple of weeks. So she was creating a pretty severe inflammatory reaction because the IUD wasn't even in place. And the crazy part of the story is she luckily, just by chance, never got pregnant within that period of time. Now, how long had that been out of place? Was it, from the time that she started having pain, 18 months before this conversation or 6 months or so after she had it inserted? It's hard to say, but there was a direct correlation with that. But again, I've seen, spoken to and seen many women who have had it removed, and, the doctors will give them a hard time. Sometimes not. More often they do, though. And they'll say, well, it's perfectly in place. This is not what's causing your back pain or your, emotional issues or your bleeding, whatever the case may be. And I'll tell you, way more often than not, it is. I honestly can't recall. And of course, this is not a promotion to tell any woman to just go have their IUDs removed. I'm not giving medical advice like that. But I can honestly say I've never had or been told by a woman, hey, I had that removed and I only feel worse. And I wish I never had it removed and they've had it put back in. I honestly can't recall just even one case where someone has told me that. If you look at how our bodies are your own body is interconnected throughout, your entire systems are all connected. Your organs are connected to your muscles and your muscles are connected to your bones. This whole like fascial matrix that people talk about in manual therapies today, and our connective tissue that, connects our ears to our toes and our liver to our arms. And, everything is some way a continuous unit of a sensory connection of this fascia. So when you do something to any organ or any part of your body, you're in some way going to be affecting another area of your body, for better or for worse. So when you insert something like this, a foreign device into your uterus, you are obviously going to be affecting that organ directly, but you're especially going to be affecting the area around that, the pelvis, the SI joints, the lower back, the pubic symphysis, the legs, of course. And that in turn can affect your entire spine, therefore your neck, and, go up, down, out to your hands and, affect liver metabolism, liver detoxification. You can really get almost any symptom from inserting an IUD. It's not like, although there's more common things like back pain or when you get into hormones, emotional issues or other hormonal issues like how it affects your thyroid or your adrenal glands. But it's really endless how an IUD can affect a female. So in a way, I say nothing is off the table. If a woman came to me and said, I put the IUD in and now my little toe hurts, not that I've heard that, I'm just using that as an exaggerated example. And she said I had the IUD removed and my little toe got better. I would not be surprised.
Well, I love that you said that. It really resonated with me when you were talking about how everything is connected. So, with the hormonal IUD, I think it might be a little bit more apparent, a little bit more obvious or expected that you'd have some sort of disruption. I think it's interesting that people think the IUD is so harmless. Many women lose their periods altogether after a period of time on the IUD. So back to that whole low dose concept, well, it has to be high enough to shut off to shut down your ovaries. And whenever you shut down a woman's ovaries, there are hormonal effects. So I think one of the myths around hormonal birth control is that only some women experience side effects. But in order for that birth control to shut down your ovaries, it has to have an impact on your hormones. If it didn't have an impact on your hormones, you would just get pregnant. You mentioned that when you take hormonal birth control, it has far-reaching impacts on the body. You mentioned it has an impact on the adrenals and thyroid. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how, an influx of synthetic hormones actually does impact the body.
Sure. Hormonally, let's just take progesterone, for example. So a lot of women, well, let's just go back and say, a lot of women are taking a birth control substance, whether that be the IUD or the pill, either obviously because they're not wanting to get pregnant or because they're having some hormonal issue, whether that be acne, super bad periods, cramping, PMS, whatever the case may be, and they're trying to curtail those symptoms. Now, when you are altering your hormones, it's like you said, you're altering your body's response to hormones, and basically now giving yourself a false level of some synthetic dose that is at a a steady throughout the month. And as you know, and I'm sure a lot of your seasoned listeners know, that a woman's hormonal levels should be changing for the most part to some degree daily, especially at the second half of the cycle in the luteal phase. So when you're taking a synthetic hormone, they're taking the same dose, every day. And in the case of, say, the Mirena, the Mirena it's not a computer. It's not giving you a different dose of a released synthetic progesterone, lower in the first half of the cycle, higher after ovulation. It's basically just giving you a level dose throughout the whole month. Now, when most women have hormonal issues, in my experience, and I would say most, if not all, natural healthcare docs, we view that as some sort of estrogen dominance. More women, or a vast number of women, way over a low progesterone over high progesterone have estrogen dominance, which is either because they're not breaking down estrogen or their progesterone levels are low. So even though the Mirena hormone or the Mirena IUD is releasing just progesterone, that progesterone can still convert and does convert into estrogen and can still create an estrogen dominance in the woman. And obviously in the case of a birth control pill, there's typically some, dose between progesterone and estrogen, even though the estrogen levels, as you said, typically tend to be lower than what they used to be. So women end up being estrogen dominant because of this imbalance between progesterone and estrogen, or their inability to detoxify estrogen. And most women tend to run progesterone because progesterone is easily used up, or you might say sacrificed, due to some stress that she is having, either emotionally, physically, or nutritionally. The progesterone levels are used up to fuel the cortisol pathway. So a woman will have typically, if there's a high level of cortisol from some stress response, then the substrates, the things that go and make cortisol in the body, this adrenal hormone that increases under times of stress, then those nutrients, those precursors now are going to basically shunt towards more cortisol rather than progesterone. So a woman ends up with a lowered progesterone and a higher cortisol level. So that's why a lot of women tend to feel better when they take progesterone, either as a cream or an oral pill, or maybe in this case, in an IUD, because they're progesterone deficient. But just giving her progesterone obviously doesn't correct the problem, even though her symptoms might lessen to various degrees, depending on the severity of the problem. But it will basically just perpetuate or fuel that stress response. It's not addressing and correcting the problem. So over time, the body gets used to that altered level of progesterone. And, this is what you see with a lot of hormones is, it's either getting too much over time, or they get used to the static flow of the progesterone, and your body craves more and more and more, like it does most hormones. And then you stop, your body, basically needs more to have the same effect. So you sort of have this what's called receptor downregulation of the progesterone, so it's no longer experience the effect that it originally had. Long story short, more hormonal issues end up after that. Now you need progesterone to stimulate thyroid peroxidase enzymes for your thyroid, so that increases your T4 and your T3 levels. So basically, if you're not having the proper amount of progesterone, you can end up with a lowered thyroid. And then in turn, those thyroid hormones basically sensitize your tissues, the cells in your body, to progesterone. So that's why a lot of women will have, typically more women have thyroid low or hypothyroid problems than men. I'm not sure of the statistics. In my practice, I would say it's easily 20 to 1. I see a lot of women with hormonal thyroid issues compared to men. I also see a lot more women in my practice than men. So that number might be a little, skewed because of that. But more women will have thyroid issues than us guys because of the effects of progesterone on the thyroid and how it affects the thyroid hormones, and then how the thyroid hormones again sensitize the tissues to the progesterone itself. So you get this progesterone thyroid balance, you might say, and excess estrogen or estrogen dominance will also suppress the thyroid. So in other words, the balance of progesterone and estrogen is important for thyroid health. And then the thyroid adrenal balance is a very intricate balance too, that between the two of them, they sort of work together to provide energy and metabolism, and a lot of the, or not a lot, I should say, but the first half of a woman's cycle, actually a good amount of the progesterone comes from the actual adrenal glands, where the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase, comes more from the actual the ovaries. So the adrenal glands have a dramatic effect on the health of a woman over her monthly cycle, sort of tying in the balance between the ovaries and the thyroid. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing or too long-winded, but
well, I think it's very helpful, because basically what you just described is exactly what synthetic hormones do. So as you were describing the process, I mean, what kept coming to mind is that for a lot of women, it is confusing, because when we talk about hormonal birth control, doctors are quick to call those synthetic hormones estrogen and progesterone, except they're different to the hormones. So what you just described is this process of endocrine disruption. And it's something I talk about a lot on the show, because a lot of women are, buying organic food and, getting rid of the hormone meat from the store and doing all of these things, even, changing their cleaning supplies at home to try to minimize their chemical exposure. And meanwhile, they have, an IUD, Mirena or a Skyla, that's giving them essentially a hormone disrupting synthetic chemical every day that has obviously effects on thyroid, adrenals, your natural hormones, and everything like that. So I think what you described is sufficiently complicated, because it is complicated, and these drugs are disrupting your natural hormone balance. Like, you can't actually have balanced hormones when you're taking any type of hormonal birth control. It's impossible.
Exactly. Or in this case, you could even put the Paragard in there, even though there's no direct hormone release from the Paragard. I would put that in the same category as the Mirena, that it's still going to influence your hormones overall, because there's a pretty close relationship between copper and estrogen. Just as there is zinc with progesterone. So many women, maybe they've done some sort of blood test or even certain hair analysis that measure zinc copper ratios. And zinc is very closely related to progesterone, copper very related to estrogen. So they'll end up with these copper toxicities, which can mimic estrogen toxicities in the body. And then when you get into copper toxicities, which, is a mineral that we all need to some low degree, copper makes important neurotransmitters in our brain. Copper is what, gives you healthy bile salts in your gallbladder so you can properly digest fat. But when you end up with a toxicity now of the mineral, like a heavy metal, then you can have other problems, of course, just like any other heavy metal toxicity, like aluminum, mercury, or arsenic, or something like that. But you also get an estrogen effect from that. So you can end up with a sort of pseudoestrogen dominance from this copper toxicity. And with all hormones, it's sometimes not as important about what's high or what's low, but the balance between the estrogen and progesterone. So I've said to women before, you're going to feel better if both your hormones are low, as opposed to if your estrogen is normal and your progesterone is low. You're going to feel better when you have this balance between progesterone and estrogen that you're supposed to have at each time throughout the month. Depending on where each hormone should be as you go through the monthly cycle. So there's a lot that can go wrong in that. And when you alter that function through some process like this, and in this case, that's why I say even with the Paragard, because now you're affecting an organ, you're affecting the uterus. Okay, someone could say, well, the ovaries are really where the hormones are coming from, but I would say, it's all connected, and there's still a hormonal influence from the uterus. And, you affect one, you're going to affect the other. And the end result is you're affecting the entire hormonal system. And it's such an intricate balance within the body. You don't have to do much to throw it off.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that was, going to be the natural kind of progression of, we kind of have that idea that the Mirena has hormones, and a lot of women specifically, as you alluded to earlier in our conversation, a lot of women specifically choose the copper IUD because it does not impact hormones. And, as a fertility awareness educator, I get the question a lot from women, can I chart my cycles with the copper IUD? I get the impression that, women believe that when they're using the copper IUD, their cycles are exactly the same as they would be normally, except they can't get pregnant. And so, it's interesting that you described the relationship between copper and estrogen and how potentially the copper IUD does have an impact on hormonal balance. So I'd love to hear more about that and also you mentioned something interesting in your article, which was that, some countries don't use copper for their IUDs. I wonder if every woman knows that the copper isn't just incidental, it's chosen for a reason. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I believe, unless I don't claim to know everything, and I don't claim to be an expert in this or any subject. I'm just like to think that I'm aware. But I believe that the copper, the reason for the copper is strictly as a spermicide. I know that the copper can oxidize. It can cause damage to the cervix and the uterus. So again, this is something that, there might be some changes in the last few years since I wrote this article, but people do know that due to the oxidizing effect of the copper and that potential, or the cases that have occurred, some countries have started making them stainless steel or putting something around that copper to hopefully cut down that effect. I don't know the success of those or how that's been over the many years. Copper, some people talk about, Wilson's disease, which is a genetic disease of like a copper overload. So it's kind of like what women are being told, or what I hear that they're being told is that, you don't have to worry about the copper. It's a low dose. So they're given that same story. It's a low dose of copper. You're not going to end up with Wilson's disease, or you're not going to end up with a copper toxicity because it's such a low dose. The same as they are, with the Mirena. Oh, it's a low dose of progesterone. I think the Mirena is about 20 or right around there, about 20 micrograms per day of the synthetic progesterone. So, again, they're being told that these are really low doses, but it doesn't take a lot to really mess around with the body. And back to your other question, which I talked briefly about with the copper and the zinc. I mean, geez, there's so much to say about that. When I started practice about 20 years ago, I definitely saw a lot more. I think women are more aware today, at least the women that I see. So I can honestly say I have the experience of women coming into my practice with IUDs and with birth control pills, of course, or I wouldn't be talking to you. But over the past, say 5 years, it's not as much as what I used to see. I think that's partly because I don't see as many new patients as I used to because I've been in practice for so long. And also, I think a lot more women who are referred to me are already aware. So they tend to come to me either having it already removed or being like, oh, they're already very naturally minded. So they're not coming in taking a birth control already anyway. But what I can tell you is when I have seen women, and a lot in the past, taking the hormonal, or of course hormonal, the pill, an estrogen progesterone dose of some sort, depending on the so many different types out there today, we'd see a lot of copper toxicities or copper zinc imbalances. In other words, a woman would show a need for zinc, and we could test that. I do a lot of muscle testing in my practice, so I would check a certain muscle and have them taste zinc, put it on their tongue, and we can see an immediate oral nutrient, it's called like an indicator testing, where the sensory taste bud response will affect the motor output of the muscles, and you can see that muscle fire better, turn on. And also there's actually even like nutrients that are supposed to taste like zinc, and if you can't taste them, they're called the zinc taste test. And if you can't taste them, they sort of taste like water, this liquid. It typically means that that person is deficient in zinc. And would see that a lot with a woman taking some sort of birth control, either on the Paragard or the pill, some sort of oral pill, because they're throwing off that copper zinc balance. And when you get into throwing off those types of Minerals, that's where you get into things like affecting, thyroid hormone. Again, because, the body is always, your body cares about balance more than anything. I tell people, let's say you only had 10 nutrients in your body, just to make this easy to understand. You would feel better if all 10 of your nutrients were at kind of like substandard low levels, as opposed to if 9 of your nutrients were at normal levels and one of them was at a very low level. You'd feel worse from that one nutrient that is very low and out of balance with the others. So when you get into playing around with, nutrient ratios like copper, zinc, that in turn is going to go back and affect your thyroid. I mean, you need copper and zinc in a certain ratio to make, that thyroid peroxidase enzyme that I mentioned a little while ago, which is, your main enzyme to make thyroid hormone, to make T4 and T3. So that doesn't mean more is better. It doesn't mean more copper means more thyroid hormone and more zinc means more thyroid hormone. It means the balance between those two. Copper and zinc have to do with immune system function, certain, how white blood cells are made. Copper is actually a component of your red blood cells. Everybody thinks of iron and maybe B12 and folic acid, but, you also need minerals like copper, like molybdenum and, minerals like that. So you can create a copper toxicity that someone might not say you're toxic because you're showing up normal within, say, a blood test range, a serum level, but that copper might be suppressing your iron to some degree, and maybe that's making your periods worse. Or maybe that copper is suppressing, your zinc level or your molybdenum level, and that's affecting your immune system. So the implications of playing around with hormones and playing around with minerals and playing around with how tissues affect one another, I don't think I can say it any way better than I have several times already. It's such an intricate balance, and it's easy to mess something up, and and that's why when you say, well, it's only a low dose, I mean, it's great to hear, you kind of chuckle about that as much as I do. We roll our eyes and we laugh about it because it's really a bunch of BS, that it's a low dose.
Yeah, it's effective marketing because you can call it whatever you want, but it has to be high enough to disrupt your hormones. So we can call it low or we can call it high, but it's still doing the same
It's
thing.
Still there. Yeah.
I really appreciate how you described the mineral balance. A couple of episodes ago, I've done quite a few now, as you know, I did a really interesting interview about copper toxicity. And so I'll link that to the show. But I think what I found the most interesting in that interview was that, although you hear copper IUD and then think like copper toxicity, when, in the interview, what came out was that, for women who are just on the regular birth control pill, like no IUD, no copper, the hormonal contraceptives, there's a lot of research that confirms that it does disrupt your mineral balance. So a lot of women who are just on the pill develop a copper kind of excess. So it disrupts that natural mineral balance. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about the way that minerals are balanced in our body and to have that in our mind that even though the copper IUD is not hormonal, it's still disrupting that delicate mineral balance. And what's interesting is in much the same way as the hormonal pill does, because the pill disrupts a ton of nutrients. And that is one area where it's not hard to find research to support the impact that the hormonal contraceptive different methods do have on mineral balance.
That's right. Yeah. And these minerals are also so important for, neurotransmitters in our brain. So that's why, a good example of that is, copper is needed to synthesize dopamine in your body. You actually need copper in a couple steps to make dopamine. Dopamine is our brain's neurotransmitter that gives us motivation throughout the day. It's different than serotonin. I tell people kind of helps you get out of bed and not be in a slump, where dopamine makes you thrive and feel alive and, handle stress and, have healthy libido and a feeling of, hope and all that. if you're lacking copper, you won't make dopamine very well. And if you're not making dopamine, there's a strong link between dopamine and estrogen in women and a strong link between dopamine and testosterone in men. So now you're going back, you're taking the mineral, which is affecting a neurotransmitter, which is affecting a hormone, and then the hormone will go back and affect the neurotransmitter. So you get these, numerous loops, some positive feedback loops, some negative feedback loops, when you play around with hormones and when you affect minerals. Basically, like you just said, you can't affect one without the other. And it's great that you put it that way. You don't have to take a mineral to affect a mineral in your body. You can take a hormone and affect a mineral. You can take a mineral and affect a hormone.
Yeah, no, I think that really helps to get the listeners thinking about this, because the idea to me, the idea that a copper IUD would have no impact on the menstrual cycle doesn't even make sense to me. From my understanding, one of the reasons that copper is used is because it has that effect of irritating the uterine lining. So this is something that you spoke about in your article, which is, it increases your likelihood of developing something like pelvic inflammatory disease. And so my understanding is having that, little bit of a copper IUD, it irritates the uterine lining and then makes it less hospitable to implantation if a sperm managed to, get through the spermicidal qualities. So there's a couple of specific side effects that I'd love just to touch on. And so, pelvic inflammatory disease, I mentioned that, the expulsion thing, which it's so, could you get more poetic? Like your body physically removes it, like your body rejects it. So that's something I'd like to hear more about. And also the link IUD and gallbladder. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I do say in the article, with the pelvic inflammatory disease, I thankfully haven't had a female or seen a female with a severe condition from the IUD, but I've heard stories. I've heard, the worst of them all is which one, unfortunately, someone dies from a complication from the implantation of the IUD and, an infection results from that. Of course, these are cases, that are few and far in between. But of course, if, they happen to you or they happen to someone, it doesn't matter if it's 1 in a million, because if you're the one, then it's 100%. So yeah, with the gallbladder, I wrote a couple other articles a while back on the gallbladder and how this really links with copper. Well, there's a couple ways. With the gallbladder, one is what I mentioned briefly earlier is that, copper salts are these salts contained in your bile. So, made in your liver, stored in your gallbladder. And these copper salts can obviously, since they're copper containing salts, that's what makes your bile green. If you ever, we've all been sick and maybe, thrown up some good old green bile, that's copper. Yeah, exactly. That's copper salts you're losing there or tinting your bile. So that can obviously be affected from the IUDs, in this case, maybe more the Paragard more than the hormonal Mirena. But also, your gallbladder is very closely linked to hormonal detoxification. Now, there's not a whole lot of information on that, at least compared to, say, your liver. I think most people know, even in very straightforward conventional medicine, everybody knows a lot of the effects of the liver. We all think of that as our detoxification organ, or at least one of them. But, your gallbladder is not left out of the picture. Even though you can live without your gallbladder, you can't live without your liver. And many women have their gallbladder removed. I even talk about one of the case histories about a young woman who came to me and she had an IUD. She came to me for hip problems. I'll actually read that to you since I have my website up. A woman came to my office complaining of lower back, hip, and left ankle pain, which was worse when she ran. The muscles in those areas were not functioning, based off my assessment. And I determined that they're because of her IUD. And although she seemed healthy, she had her gallbladder removed several years earlier at age 25 for unexplained trouble with the organs. She had no issue. She was eating well. It's like you were saying earlier, she was eating well, using correct cosmetics, nothing synthetic, like really clean, sort of holistic living. Yet she had the Paragard inserted about 6 months before the gallbladder troubles began. nobody had ever made the connection. And now she sees me several years later now for these hip issues, and it's kind of tough. I'm not maybe the most delicate at how I speak sometimes. I'll admit that, but it's kind of tough when you say, oh, well, the reason you probably lost your gallbladder a few years ago is because of the IUD. I mean, that's the truth of it. And that Paragard, something like that, I don't think you can call a coincidence. If you have Paragard inserted, gallbladder issues 6 months later to the point where you had to have them removed, or at least what you were told, that's by far more than just a coincidence. So, your gallbladder is going to be super stressed out with excess copper, or let's say altering copper levels, but also the hormonal effects. Again, this is why more women have gallbladder issues than us guys. There's a thing I know, in school you learn, I don't know if they still teach it, but 25 years ago they say, well, people who have gallbladder issues are the three Fs, the four Fs, female fat, fertile, 40. So basically, an overweight woman, think of fat metabolism, 40 years old, hormonal effects, so fertile and 40. The point being is that women with hormonal issues, whether from an IUD or whether from some other type of birth control, that estrogen dominance, particularly estrogen, can be a big stressor for the liver and, of course, therefore the gallbladder too. And due to the need to detoxify these hormones, testosterone, estrogen, especially, and progesterone, all your hormones, really, even your stress hormones like cortisol. So, the bigger load, the bigger stress, the bigger amount of stress you put on these glands, especially the gallbladder, the more trouble you can cause for that organ. And next thing you know, the woman has an inflammatory issue, or maybe she's not detoxifying these hormones well, and therefore she's putting a lot of stress on the gallbladder, and therefore she's not detoxifying fats well. And then she gets kind of what they term, even in an ultrasound, dirty or sludgy bile, and almost like sandy bile, like your car needs an oil change after 30,000 miles. You've kind of left it alone. And then you create a stone or, some inflammation in the area. And then, the gallbladder problems start up, some more severe than others. So it's just a direct link with the hormones, or the copper in this case, whether that's the copper itself or the copper affecting the estrogen, like we just discussed, and how that affects the liver and the gallbladder. So
I really appreciate you taking the time to really go through that and painting a picture. I feel like what comes out of this conversation is something that I talk about all the time, but, one of the reasons that I started the podcast is to really challenge that cultural message that as a woman, that our menstrual cycles are somehow separate from us, as if our period is sitting on a beach somewhere outside of our bodies. One of the messages that I aim to come through, just through, if you listen to kind of the back catalog of interviews, is really that your menstrual cycle is a part of you. And if you alter your reproductive cycles, you alter yourself. And so I really appreciate the way that you've taken us through this and really painted a picture of just how interconnected all of these different processes in the body are. So, you've probably noticed that I haven't spent a whole lot of time asking you about alternatives to hormonal birth control. I mean, ultimately, part of that reason is because the whole podcast is about that. The podcast is about fertility awareness, and I have a ton of fertility awareness, episodes. And so a lot of the women listening to this are, thinking about looking into more natural methods of birth control. But I'm curious, so when you have clients and patients that are using hormonal birth control, whether it's IUDs or just hormonal birth control, IUDs, Paragard, the copper, or the hormone based ones, how do you have that conversation? Because many practitioners at least would say, okay, at least go for the copper because there's no hormones. But you're saying, and I can't say that I don't agree with you, but you're basically saying that, you've seen a lot of problems with the IUDs. So, no hormonal birth control, no IUDs. What do you do?
Right. So I basically tell them what I see in my experience, and I have them look at the stories of the other women, and the hundreds of comments now on the website. Ultimately it's their decision. But here's my experience with this is, once I don't want to say like show them the light, but kind of make that connection for them, I don't have to convince them. I hear more often than not, I was kind of wondering if that was a problem, or it's like I mentioned earlier, I think with like, saying that their intuition might have told them something wasn't correct about that. A lot of times I run into a woman, who basically said, well, the only reason I was keeping that in is because my medical doctor convinced me to keep it in. I really don't want it in, and I'm just sticking it out for the 5 years anyway. Or they don't want to go through the trouble of having it removed, either because it's inconvenient or, unfortunately, I hear way too often, or have heard way too often, that they don't want to be given a hard time by the doctor who put it in to remove it. Like, oh, they're going to kill me if I go back in there. I don't want to deal with that. It's like, it's pretty sad if you can't. I mean, I would feel terrible if someone was saying that about me. I don't want to go back to him for this reason, or I don't want to have to face him. I mean, this is your own body you're talking about. You're in charge. You shouldn't be doing anything because anybody tells you to do, for or against. It should be ultimately your own decision. If someone's convincing you to do something, and that's the only reason you're doing it is because someone convinced you, you probably shouldn't be doing that. So I don't ever want to convince someone. I want to give them my experience, let them know how I think these things are linked within the body and how it's affecting them, and ultimately have them make that decision based off everything that I've just mentioned. In terms of an alternative, I definitely have never, ever, and I never would recommend, as you just said, for a woman to get, switch from the Mirena to the Paragard. I think that would be a complete waste of time and problems even. I can't remember if I had, or some women ended up going to a birth control, like an oral pill, which is kind of the lesser of two evils, because now at least you don't have the implantation, but you're dealing with hormones, and it's still an issue. I could probably safely say some women have done that over the years, just because like I said earlier, like getting pregnant would just be the end of it all for them. There's not a lot of alternatives out there, other than, of course, knowing your own cycle and knowing when you can obviously get pregnant. I was looking through your website earlier, which I was really impressed with some of the things you have to say. And you're right about so many things. Like, I'm really surprised how many women don't know their cycle. I mean, I see a lot of women and I'll say, well, how many days was your cycle this month? And they'll say 5. I'll say, no, how many days was the cycle? Like, not your period. Yeah. And then they'll give me, and they'll be like, okay, well, when's day 1? And they'll say like, oh, I'm on day 6. And then you realize after talking to them and trying to do the math, they start the first day after their period ends. Like, no, that's, we start before that. And they're really never properly educated on their periods, on their menses, on their cycles. And it's a really neat way, I think. Even though I know, most women will tell me it's an inconvenience, I mean, I can understand that. To have a period every month like you're supposed to. But it's a really good indication of your overall health. Hey, if you get breast tenderness at a certain time of the month, ovulation, or at the end of the month, period time, whatever, it's an indication that you're not detoxifying estrogen. If you're getting emotional issues, well, it's an indication how your estrogen levels are affecting your thyroid. If you start crying at a commercial during your period, well, guess what's happening? Your neurotransmitters are completely altered, and so is your thyroid because of the hormones. So when you take something that's now going to mimic your hormones, whether that be an IUD or an oral pill or an implant or whatever, and you're normalizing, I put that in quotes, a hormonal cycle and suppressing your hormones and altering function, and your symptoms go away, all you're doing is masking this problem, and you're masking your body's clues to tell you what's going on throughout your month. And and that can be as important as just functioning better, or even preventing things like cancer, like perhaps breast cancer due to the implications of high estrogen levels in breast cancer. I mean, if you're altering those levels and not having PMS now and not getting breast tenderness because how you're altering these levels, you might, you're losing this awareness of how you're not detoxifying hormones properly. So I think it's really important, I tell that to everybody, even guys, to be aware of how their body is functioning and pay attention to signs and symptoms. And when you mess around with the hormonal process, you're really altering, your body's clues throughout the month.
Well, we've talked about, we've really hashed out this topic, and I'm really glad that you were here, and this conversation was a lot of fun, and I'm really glad that we had it. It's an important one. And, hopefully someday there'll be a lot more research that we can draw from to really see what the science has to say about these IUDs. But what is one thing, given everything we've talked about today, that you would really like for the listeners to take away from our conversation?
I would say, well, I'm going to make it two things, but they're related to one. One would be, if you're ever thinking of getting an IUD, don't. So that'd be one, like, don't even go down that road. Hopefully, I'd like to say if we can convince you to never even just take that off your plate and you're considering it, don't do it. Like, don't even bother. For those who have it, I would say, again, this is not telling anybody to go have it removed. And, my biggest fear is that, and even when I wrote this article, okay, women are going to go have this removed. I'm going to hear, even with patients, like, they're going to get pregnant. I'm going to, all these problems, because some people don't know when they get pregnant and all this. And thankfully that hasn't happened. But, if you already have an IUD in, I guess I would just say, really think about how you feel each day. Think about, maybe take back or think back, like, how you felt before the IUD. How are you feeling now? Maybe some of your symptoms are being told, you feel achy every day, or you're tired because of, your age, you're given that, oh, you're a certain age, that's normal at your age, or weird symptoms like that. I guess my message is that it's very possible that your symptoms, no matter what they may be, emotional, energy, sleep issues, or of course, structural issues, especially hip, neck, joint pain, can definitely and is often a result of these IUDs, and that little bit of stress caused that this very, very lightweight piece of wire is causing on this sensitive organ, and kind of like throwing off the balance of your body.
Oh, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Gangemi. This was a great episode.
Thank you.
I would love for you to share your websites and a little bit about the work you do and how our listeners can get in touch with you, or if some of our listeners are local to where you operate out of.
Sure. Well, I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I have my two main websites are my Dr. Gangemi website, which is drgangemi.com. And then my other website is more, even though they both have information for everybody, it's more of a natural treatment and prevention website for athletes, which is called SOCDoc, SOCK-DOC.com, which is basically, I'm always barefoot in the office. It's a movement flow sort of, barefoot lifestyle, minimalist lifestyle office / website. So there's, between the two websites, there's, well over 300 or so podcasts with people like you who have looked into my work. I appreciate that, as well as articles and videos and that sort of thing.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was really my pleasure to have you. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/161. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Gangemi. I found it to be very eye-opening, and I really enjoyed having the conversation around the different types of IUDs, so the hormonal IUD versus the copper IUD. And I really enjoyed hearing Dr. Gangemi's patient experiences and just kind of his reflections on what he's seen and why he's become so passionate about IUDs and just essentially warning women about it. So, with that being said, I know that there are women that are, extremely happy with their IUDs and they just love it. And so it's not to minimize a positive experience that many women may have with it. I feel that it's really important to talk about the possible side effects, as you all know from listening to the show. One of the things that strikes me the most when I talk to women about their experiences with hormonal birth control, even if the women say that their experiences were positive, is that, I'm usually talking to women after they've come off of them. So I often talk to women who really didn't have any negative experiences that they knew of when they were on hormonal contraceptives. But as soon as they came off, they noticed all this stuff shifted for them. And so some of the most common things I hear are that a haze came off of them. They felt more like themselves. So it was only kind of after they removed the hormones from their body that they really had that true sense of how it was different for them and what those hormones were doing. And so I think one of the important pieces that came out of this interview is that the hormonal IUD is still a hormonal contraceptive method. And so when the drug companies are advertising them and stressing that they're low dose and you're not getting as many hormones into your body and those types of things. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that whenever you're using a hormonal contraceptive method, they have to put enough hormones in it for it to interfere with ovulation. So they can call it low dose, they can call it a rainbow, they can call it whatever they want. But at the end of the day, they have to put in enough hormones for it to interfere with ovulation, or else it wouldn't work. Remember, that's how contraceptives work. They work by interfering with your ovulation. So they are disrupting your endocrine system by definition, because that's how they prevent pregnancy. And so I feel like those types of creative advertising, they're very effective, because then you take a hormonal birth control method and you think, well, it's low dose, so it's totally fine. You can call it whatever you want, but it still has to have enough hormones for it to disrupt your endocrine system. Especially if anyone's listening and they've actually had the Mirena IUD for a long time. Many women lose their periods altogether on the Mirena IUD, and so for years. And so if you think about that, well, there has to be enough hormones in it in order for that to happen. And so that's interfering with your normal cycle and your normal ovulation. But with that in mind, not every woman loses her period on the Mirena IUD. And as far as the copper IUD is concerned, I think it's also helpful to know that it does disrupt your normal reproductive function. So I feel like the message that comes across to women is that it's exactly like not having any, because it's hormone free, it doesn't really do anything to your cycle. Your cycle will be the same. You'll still ovulate and everything. And you're just going to have this IUD inside of you. And so there is some degree of truth to that, but it's important to know that, copper is selected for a reason, and it does create a localized inflammatory response in your uterus. And so it does disrupt your periods. And so I've seen studies that have been done on the length of the menstrual cycle. And there's one study I'm thinking about in particular that found that women who were using copper IUDs had shorter luteal phases than women who weren't. And so it did affect their progesterone levels. So the shorter your luteal phase is, the less progesterone that you have. And so even though it's not a hormonal method, it's still having an impact on your hormone production. And so I think it's just helpful to know. And it's not to say that no one should ever use them or anything like that. It's more about informed consent. I think that when you're using, especially a method that you're having inserted into your uterus, that's fairly permanent, because you can't just stop taking it. You have to make an appointment and go to your doctor, and it's quite expensive. So it's an investment. And so, this is a big deal. Before you go into something like that, it's really important to know what the possible side effects could be, because then you know what to look for. I can't tell you how many women I've spoke to who, and as you already know from listening to some of the episodes, so I'll link in the show notes some of the Pill Reality series episodes that I've released recently. I think at the time of this recording, I've released 3 of them. One of the themes when I speak to women who are coming off of hormonal contraceptives, even if they were happy with them when they were on it, is that no one told them that some of the most common side effects associated with hormonal contraceptives are mood changes like depression and anxiety and panic attacks and paranoid thoughts and things like that. And so it's really important just to have that discussion awareness so that if you happen to experience some of those side effects, that you know. And also, low libido is also very important. And as we talked about in the vulvodynia episode, changes to the actual physical structure of your vulva. If you're thinking about transitioning from one form or another of hormonal birth control, or just ready to really dig into fertility awareness and gain confidence using the method, either for birth control or to help you gain a deeper understanding of what's happening in your cycle if you're trying to conceive, then I invite you to head over to fertilityfriday.com/work-with-me. I have a number of programs and they're all listed there. So make sure to head over there and check them out. So I just want to thank you again for listening to the show. I podcast for you. I love the feedback that I continue to receive about the podcast. And for those of you who want to continue this conversation and want to talk more about IUDs, or if you've had an experience with an IUD, whether it's the copper IUD or the hormonal IUD, I would love to hear about it in the Facebook group. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/community for your invitation to this private Facebook group that I host for the Fertility Friday community. And I would love to hear more about your experiences if you use the IUD and had either a positive or negative experience. I'd love to hear what your experience was like. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to the show and taking me along wherever you're going. If you're walking the dog or commuting to work, doing laundry or dishes at home, whatever it is. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend listening to this podcast. There are literally hundreds of thousands of podcasts you could be listening to, and you're listening to mine. So I really appreciate that. So thanks again. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.